Now to Jacinta Price at the Press Club today. Now, Jacinta's a friend of mine, someone I respect enormously, but this speech demands serious scrutiny because this is the Shadow Indigenous Affairs Minister giving the main pitch to reject the Voice referendum. And she claimed the yes case was based on lies. A very strong word. The trouble is, none of what she put forward as lies were anything of the kind. So it was a misleading rather than rational argument. Let me go to the worst of these alleged lies, one that's wildly wrong and is deliberately designed to generate fear about the Voice.
But I have to address the third lie that underpins the divisive Voice. That is that it is simply just an advisory body. Nowhere in the question that will be put to Australians or in the proposed chapter on which we are voting do the words advice, advise or advisory appear. If the Prime Minister truly intended for this body to be a simple advisory body, as he, his government and the advocates of the Voice repeatedly tell us, then it would have been stipulated in the proposed chapter.
This is simply untrue. The Voice is advisory only. Price and the Coalition and their legal advisors must know this. In fact, as I've mentioned here before, the only reason the words make representations are used is to make doubly sure all of the politicians, lawyers and courts know very clearly that there is no obligation on government to act on whatever views come from the Voice. Here's constitutional law professor Anne Toomey.
Well, the first draft of the proposal, sort of some time back, 2014, did use the word advice, and then concerns were raised by people that, well, sometimes advice in a conventional sense means that you're sort of obliged to comply with it. So the example there is the Governor-General being obliged to act upon ministerial advice, and people said, well, no, that's not what we intend. We don't intend any obligation on the government to actually have to comply with the advice. So that advice was a sort of a dangerous word because it might give that kind of an implication.
So the phrase make representations is used deliberately to make sure the Voice is weaker so that it is only advice. No one can expect that the government must act on it.
Well, that was the point of it, yes. So there was a concern that it could have been interpreted, if you use the word advice, as somehow binding by way of a constitutional convention. Nobody wanted that. It was simply always to be an ability to better inform government, but government not ever being obliged to take that advice or respond to it.
There you go. Now, this is critical, as you'd understand, because the most reassuring, the most factual answer to all the scares run against the Voice is simply to clarify that it is an advisory body only. It cannot deliver anything. It can't deliver a treaty. It can't deliver reparations. It can't deliver anything. The Voice can only ask governments for action. All the power remains with the Parliament or the governments. And let me just finish on a major contradiction of the No Campaign's argument about division. It was exposed by an insightful question.
You have criticised the Voice because of the division you say it would create and the idea of preferential treatment for one group. At the same time, you've accepted the Shadow Indigenous Australians portfolio. So what is your key policy for Indigenous Australians? And should the portfolio and the Shadow portfolio exist?
That's a really good question, because I think I've said publicly that ultimately the Voice is a contradictory in itself because it's supposed to be about closing the gap, but if you constitutionally enshrine it, that's suggesting the gap will exist in perpetuity, and that is not what we want. The same can be said for the portfolio that I hold. I would hope to see that one day in our country we wouldn't require such a portfolio, because if we don't have that portfolio, it means that everybody is taking advantage of the same opportunities that our country has to offer. So
why should it exist now under that thinking if you don't want to see a separation between the two?
Why should it exist now? Because, well, it does exist. It already exists. It's what I've been given the responsibility to be part of.
Yeah, that exposes the big contradiction, the big paradox, if you like, of the No campaign. They claim a voice is divisive, but they promise to legislate a voice themselves. They say we should all be treated exactly the same, but they're happy to keep their Indigenous Affairs departments, their Indigenous Affairs projects, special laws for Indigenous people, special funding for Indigenous people, and Indigenous Affairs ministers. Now, either all these should go because they are divisive, or if they're all worthwhile, then surely we ought to have a voice to give Indigenous people a say on them. And of course, the Coalition supports the latter. They support legislating a voice too. They support it all, including having a minister for Indigenous Australians. The only thing the Coalition objects to is for the Constitution to mandate that we should have a voice. They just want to legislate one under existing provisions. That's all. That's the only point of difference. None of this could be divisive, as the Coalition claims, because then surely the Coalition wouldn't be supporting it. They only oppose the constitutional mandate. All this aggressive rhetoric back and forth, and we see most of the division is largely confected for party political purposes, because there's very little to debate between the parties at all.